On the night of the 10th of May, 1849, New York City, then the great metropolis of the Union, was the scene of one of those horrors of civilization which for a time make the great heart of humanity stop in its beatings. In the darkness of night, thousands of citizens were gathered in a central square of the most aristocratic quarter of New York, gathered around one of its most conspicuous and magnificent edifices, the Astor-Place Opera House. Around this edifice a vast crowd was gathered. On the stage, the English actor Macready was trying to play the part of Macbeth, in which he was interrupted by hisses and hooting and encouraged by the cheers of a large audience who had crowded the house to sustain him. On the outside, a mob was gathering, trying to force an entrance into the house and throwing volleys of stones at the barricaded windows. In the house, the police were arresting those who made the disturbance. Outside, they were driven back by volleys of paving stones. In the midst of this scene of clamor and outrage was heard the clatter of a troop of horse approaching the scene. The military are coming," was the exclamation of the crowd. Further on was heard the quick tramp of companies of infantry, and there was seen the gleam of bayonets. A cry of rage burst from the mob. The appearance of an armed force seemed to inspire them with a sudden fury. They ceased storming the opera house and turned their volleys against the horsemen. Amid piercing yells and execrations, men were knocked from their horses, the untrained animals were frightened, and the force was speedily routed and could not afterwards be rallied to perform any efficient service. Now came the turn of the infantry. They marched down the sidewalk in a solid column, but had no sooner taken up a position for the protection of the house than they were assailed with volleys of missiles. Soldiers were knocked down and carried off wounded. An attempt to charge with the bayonet was frustrated by the thick crowd seizing the muskets and attempting to wrest them from the hands of the soldiers. At last the awful command was given to fire. There was a gleam of sulphurous light, a sharp, quick rattle, and here and there in the crowd a man sank upon the pavement with a deep groan or a death rattle. Then came a more furious attack and a wild yell of vengeance. Then the rattle of another death-dealing volley, far more fatal than the first. The ground was covered with killed and wounded. The pavement was stained with blood. A panic seized the multitude, which broke and scattered in every direction. In the darkness of the night, yells of rage, screams of agony, and dying groans were mingled together. The military, resting from their work of death, in stern silence were grimly guarding the opera house. Its interior was a rendezvous and a hospital for the wounded military and police. Here and there around the building and at the corners of the streets were crowds of men talking in deep and earnest tones of indignation. There were little processions moving off with the dead or mutilated bodies of their friends and relations. The result of that night's work was the death of 22 victims, either shot dead upon the spot or mortally wounded. Into the causes which led to a result so fatal and all the circumstances attending it, it will now be our duty to inquire. A Mr. Edwin Forrest, the American tragedian, was born in the city of Philadelphia. He was born in humble life and worked his way up from poverty and obscurity to wealth and fame. After various adventures, young Forrest found himself in the city of New York in the year 1826, when Guilford was about to open the Bowery Theatre. He wanted a star of powerful attraction, and his experienced eye fell on Forrest. He was engaged. Forrest used his mental gifts and great personal advantages with discretion and effect, and became a star of the first magnitude, so that in a short time he demanded and received $200 a night for his performances. Mr. William C. Macready was an English actor of great eminence who gave his chief attention to the plays of Shakespeare, in which he had shown himself a thorough artist. In 1827, 1 year after the successful commencement of Mr. Forrest's career, Mr. Macready visited the United States. Macready and Forrest were starring through the country, playing alternate engagements, but not so far as we know developing any very decided feelings of rivalry. Their roles of characters and spheres of action were quite apart. But it so happened that in most of the cities where Macready was engaged, there were more theaters than one and of consequence rival managers. Where one of these had secured Mr. Macready, the other was anxious to get the best talent to be found to run against him, and there was no one so available as Mr. Forrest. The result was that the constant rivalry of Forrest, though carried on in the most friendly manner, could not fail to injure the success of Macready. A certain degree of partisanship was everywhere excited. for Forrest was everywhere placarded as the American tragedian, and the tour of Mr. Macready was comparatively a failure. A sensitive man could not but feel this, and whether he made any complaint or not, his friends saw what the difficulty was and felt not a little chagrined about it. And when Mr. Forrest made his next and last professional visit to England, this feeling among the friends of Macready, in the theatrical press and the play-going public, found its vent. The opposition to him was, from the first, marked and fatal, and so far as the metropolis was concerned, his tour was a failure. It was only in the provinces, away from London influence, that he met with any degree of success. There was no need of Mr. Macready taking any active part in this matter, and there is no proof that he did so, but much to the contrary. But Mr. Forrest hastily and indignantly, and we doubt not sincerely, charged it upon Mr. Macready, and one night, when the latter was playing in Hamlet at the theatre in Edinburgh, Mr. Forrest, who was seated in a private box, had the bad taste, as well as bad feeling, to hiss a portion of his performance in the most marked and offensive manner. The following letter from Mr. Forrest gives his own account of this affair.
There are two legitimate modes of evincing approbation and disapprobation in the theatre, one expressive of approbation by the clapping of hands, and the other by hisses to mark dissent, and as well-timed and hearty applause is the just meed of the actor who deserves well so also is hissing, a salutary and wholesome corrective of the abuses of the stage. And it was against one of these abuses that my dissent was expressed. The truth is, Mr. Macready thought fit to introduce a fancy dance into his performance of Hamlet, which I thought, and still think, a desecration of the scene, and at which I evinced that disapprobation. It must be observed also that I was by no means solitary in this expression of opinion.
Mr. Forrest, chagrined by his failure in England, and maddened at what he imagined to be the malign influence of Macready, returned to the United States. He had publicly hissed Macready in Edinburgh, had avowed the act and given his reasons. His friends here felt much as the friends of Mr. Macready had felt in England, and when the latter came on another professional visit to the United States, he found that a bitter feeling had been raised against him, which found its first expression, so far as we know, in the following article that appeared in the Boston Mail on the morning of Mr. Macready's appearance at the Howard Athenaeum, Boston.
Mr. Macready has at length arrived. The reader will no doubt ask what fault we find with Mr. Macready. Our charges against Macready are based upon more important grounds. It is his conduct in his own country in relation to Mr. Forrest that we are about investigating. His inhospitality, his crushing influence, his vindictive opposition, and his steadfast determination to ruin the prospects of that gentleman in England that we bring to his door. Let him deny them if he can. Every true American takes a pride in that which represents his country's interests, industry, and enterprise. Mr. Edwin Forrest is titled the American Tragedian. He is justly entitled to that honor. He has acquired it by his own labors. From a poor boy in a circus, he has arisen to be a man of fame and wealth, all of which he has lastingly gained by enterprise and talent.
On his part, Mr. Macready unwisely alluded to this article in one of his before the curtain speeches, speaking contemptuously of the attacks of a certain penny paper. This brought Forrest out in the following.
Mr. Macready is stated to have said last night that up to the time of this act on my part he had never entertained towards me a feeling of unkindness. I unhesitatingly pronounce this to be a wilful and unblushing falsehood. I most solemnly aver and do believe that Mr. Macready, instigated by his narrow envious mind and his selfish fears, did secretly, not openly, suborn several writers for the English press to write me down.
But the Bostonians are a quiet people, and Macready and Forrest played through their engagements without any popular demonstration. Mr. Macready appears to have made up his mind at once to sue Forrest for a libel. It appears, however, that when Mr. Macready came to consult his legal advisers, they wisely advised him to let the matter drop and be satisfied with his reputation. So Macready went south and was feted and feasted in New Orleans to his heart's content, but to the grievous discontent of Mr. Forrest and his numerous admirers. It must not be supposed that this was the first manifestation of patriotic indignation on the part of the friends of Mr. Forrest on account of his treatment in England. It was a deep and intense feeling, and was ready to burst out on any fitting occasion. When Macready, who was charged by Forrest himself with being the head and front of this offending, came to the United States, the flame of hatred was ready to burst forth, and the only wonder is that it remained pent up so long. On his return from the south, Messrs. Niblo and Hackett, who had taken the Opera House for that purpose, announced that Mr. Macready would open an engagement on Monday night, May 7th. Mr. Forrest was playing at the Broadway Theatre. On the announcement of Mr. Macready's engagement at the Opera House, it was determined that there should be a pretty forcible expression of opinion on the part of those who were indignant at the treatment of Mr. Forrest in England and were willing, for any reason, to revenge it on Mr. Macready. There was doubtless some organization of forces to bring about this result, and when the night arrived, it was estimated by the Chief of Police that not less than 500 persons were engaged in the disturbance. The night came, the house was crowded, and there was an ominous-looking gallery. The curtain rose, and some of the actors who were popular favorites were received with obstreperous applause. But when Macready appeared upon the stage, in the character of Macbeth, he was assailed by a storm of hisses, yells, and a clamor that defies description. He stood his ground firmly, and the play went on, but not a word could be heard by the audience. The clamor rose higher and higher. Rotten eggs were thrown, and other missiles, and soon still more outrageous demonstrations were made, and chairs were thrown from the upper part of the house so as to peril life. There the Chief of Police was present, with a number of policemen, but the rioters boldly defied the authorities and no arrests were attempted. A large portion of the audience consisted of ladies whose lives might have been endangered, and there was nothing to do but to stop the performance. The curtain went down, cheers were given for Forrest and groans for Macready, and the crowd dispersed. Mr. Macready supposed that his engagement was terminated. He had no idea of ever making a second appearance, but his friends and the enemies of Forrest insisted upon a different course. He was assured that the public would sustain him, and the managers did not wish to lose the profits of his engagement. Finally, a number of influential citizens, men of wealth and standing, with Washington Irving at their head, wrote a formal request to Mr. Macready that he should play out his engagement, and pledging themselves that the public should sustain him, and it was determined and announced that he should appear on Thursday evening, May 10th. This announcement, as may be supposed, excited the indignation of those who had driven him from the stage. It was a combination of the aristocracy against the people and in support of English arrogance, and it was determined that Macready should not play, and that he and his supporters should be put down at all hazards. The announcement that Mr. Macready would appear at the Opera House in Macbeth on Thursday evening produced a varied excitement. Those who thought the city disgraced by the scenes of Monday night were anxious to have that disgrace atoned for by his successful reappearance, while those who sympathized with the mob that drove him from the stage looked upon his reappearance as a new insult, and the manner in which it was brought about was as irritating to them as the act itself. Thursday morning, the leaders on both sides were active. The friends of Forrest were gathering their forces and distributing tickets for the night's performance, while the lessees of the Opera House applied to the mayor and other authorities of New York for protection. Inflammatory handbills had been posted upon the walls of the city, calculated to increase the excitement. In the mayor's office, the recorder, the chief of police, the sheriff, Major General Sanford, and Brigadier General Hall were assembled to consult on the means of protecting the Opera House and enabling Mr. Macready to play Macbeth. The mayor, Mr. Woodhull, advised Niblo and Hackett to close the house and to avoid a riot and the probable destruction of property and life, but these gentlemen were determined to stand upon their rights, and the city authorities decided, after consulting together, to sustain them, if necessary, with all the force at their disposal. Mr. Matzel, the chief of police, was asked if the civil force at his disposal would be sufficient for the preservation of the peace, and though he had 900 salaried policemen at his disposal and the power of calling in specials at discretion, he gave it as his opinion that this force was not sufficient. It was thought necessary to call out the military. The fact of the chief of police declaring that his force was not sufficient to preserve the peace, the fact that General Sanford was ordered to call out a military force sufficient for the emergency, proves that the nature and extent of the approaching riot was well understood by the authorities, and still no means were used to prevent it. Had the police arrested a few of the leaders and kept a close watch on the rioters, had they taken possession of the vicinity of the Opera House in force and prevented the gathering of a crowd around it, It seems probable that the peace of the city and the rights of Mr. Macready might have been maintained at a trifling sacrifice, but a different course was decided upon, and the preparations of the military and police were made accordingly. And now the news spread all over the city that there was to be a riot. The warning out of large bodies of military was alone sufficient to excite curiosity, and yet, in all this excitement and anticipation of outrage, the mayor issued no warning proclamation. There was no one to tell hot-headed and misguided men that it would be at the peril of their lives if they disturbed the peace. It is evident that they thought they had a right to prevent Macready from playing. As the hour for the opening of the Opera House approached, excited crowds began to gather from all parts of the city. Hundreds of men were seen walking rapidly up Broadway. There was a great rush for tickets, and at an early hour, the house was declared full and the sale of tickets suspended. The police were at their stations, and the doors and windows were strongly barricaded, while the crowd was gathering outside and endeavoring to force an entrance, in which they were prevented by the police. The curtain rose, and the mock tragedy commenced. Mr. Clark, an American actor, was vociferously applauded in the part of Macduff. The entrance of Mr. Macready in the third scene was the signal for a storm of cheers, groans, hisses, and yells. The whole audience rose, and the greatest part, who were friendly to Macready, cheered and waved their hats and handkerchiefs. But when these cheers were spent, the noise had not subsided. A large body in the parquet and another in the amphitheatre hissed and groaned, and the contest was kept up until a placard was displayed on the stage, on which was written, "The Friends of Order will remain quiet." The Friends of Disorder, however, kept up their noise through the first act, when the recorder and chief of police decided to quell the tumult, and in a few moments, the noisiest of the rioters were arrested and conveyed to a room in the basement, and the play went on in comparative quietness. But by the time the tumult was suppressed in the house, it had gained its height on the outside. A vast crowd numbering 10 or 15,000 had gathered around the building, and by the time the arrests were made in the house, and probably in consequence of some communication between the rioters in the theatre and their friends outside, the house began to be assailed with large paving stones, and the alarmed and excited audience left the theatre by the entrance in 8th Street under the cover of the military, while Mr. Macready got away in the disguise of an officer, and mounting a horse escorted by a party of his friends, he left the city and the next day took the cars for Boston, whence a few days afterward he sailed to Europe. Before leaving, he expressed the deepest regret that he had not refused to appear again in accordance with his first intention. On Saturday morning, the coroner assembled a jury who proceeded in carriages to view the bodies of those who were killed. After viewing them and witnessing a surgical examination of each, the inquest was continued at the hall of the Court of Sessions. The mayor, recorder, sheriff, chief of police, and several military officers and citizens were examined. The jury retired at 6:30 on Sunday evening, and after being out a short time, returned the following verdict. We believe that the dead came to their deaths by gunshot wounds from balls fired by the military during the riot before the Opera House on Thursday evening, 10th May, Insta, by order of the civil authorities of the city of New York, and that the circumstances existing at the time justified the authorities in giving the order to fire upon the mob. We further believe that if a larger number of the police had been ordered out, the necessity of a resort to the use of military might have been avoided.